Hello and welcome to Written Words. I'm Helen, and in today's video, which is part of our translated word series, we're going to look at this book, The Ice Palace by Tarjei Vesaas from Norway. In this lesson, we're going to explore the background and the plot of The Ice Palace. We're going to look at some of the imagery and themes used in the novel. And we're also going to consider some of the culture-specific challenges that this novel presents to translators. The Ice Palace is a novel by the Norwegian author Tarjei Vesaas, and it was originally published in 1963 under the title Isløtet. Apologies for my Norwegian pronunciation if there are any Norwegian viewers out there. And the book was written in the nynorsk form of Norwegian, which we'll have a little look at in a moment. The story is about two young girls, Unn and Sis. Unn has recently moved to the village following the death of her mother, and the two girls become friends. At the beginning of the book, Sis goes to visit Unn, and their relationship takes an unexpected turn, which neither of them is able to articulate. Unn suggests that they undress, which they do, and then a moment later they get dressed again. But in that time, something's happened between them. Something has changed. Some kind of realization has taken place, but neither of them fully understands it. Neither of them is able to talk about it. And Sis quickly puts an end to it by running home in a panic. The next morning, Unn doesn't turn up for school. Instead, she's tormented by some unspoken guilt over something that she hasn't done, and she feels this inexplicable shame. So instead of going to school, she goes to the Ice Palace, which is a frozen waterfall. This is Norway, and it's winter. And there we watch the events unfold, along with a bird and a strange all-seeing eye, which are also watching what's happening as she ventures further and further into the palace, which is like a labyrinth, and the cold eventually claims her life. Later on, the worried villagers organise a search party, and Sis faces lots of questions, but she's unable to answer them. Unn is never found, and when the Ice Palace melts in the spring thaw, her body is swept away by the river. The Norwegian language is unusual in that it has two official written forms, nynorsk and bokmål. Bokmål being the more widely used. Therefore, the fact that this book is written in nynorsk is significant, and the work of Vesaas has helped to carve out a place for nynorsk in Norwegian literature. And that got me wondering, if an English-speaking reader were to read a book that was written, say, in the Yorkshire dialect or in Scots, that would produce a very particular impression. It would give the writing a very definite cultural, geographical flavour. So presumably a Norwegian reader would be well aware that this book was in nynorsk, and they would understand all the cultural connotations that went with that. So how can a translator translating this into a different language reflect all those cultural connotations? Is it possible? Is it even necessary? And has the translator, Elizabeth Rocken, done that in here? I'm not sure, but if there are any Norwegian experts out there who know the answer to that question, please do let me know. The work of translating a book involves lots of questions. There are lots of challenges that face the translator. One of the questions that a translator of this book would have to consider is the title itself. Isløtet, according to the dictionary, means castle or palace. In many languages, castle and palace are reflected by the same word. But to somebody from Britain, for example, a castle and a palace are two very different things. A castle is usually very old. It's a fortified building that's built to protect a country or a town or a piece of coastline from invaders or hostile forces. So it's a very sturdy building as well. A palace, on the other hand, is a luxurious dwelling. It's a home, usually to royalty, with lots of rooms and lots of luxurious furnishings. And sometimes royalty can live in a castle. For example, in England we have Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, where the royal families spend their time. But if you look at photographs of the two of them together, they're very different types of building. What is the slotted in our book? Is it a castle or is it a palace? The translator of this version has gone with palace, and personally I rather like that choice. Calling it a palace gives it the sense that Un is a beautiful fairy tale princess living in a palace made of crystal and filled with light. The Ice Palace is a very short book, and although it's written in prose, its style is very poetic. And that too can present challenges to a translator. Poetry makes use of the rhyme and the rhythm of words, and those can be easily lost in translation, as can wordplay, alliteration, double meanings, jokes, and all kinds of other things. They very often just don't work in the different language. So a large part of a literary translator's craft involves searching for words in the target language that convey both the meaning and the musicality of the original words in the source language. So now let's have a look at a little sample from the Ice Palace. I've chosen two short passages that we're going to compare. The first one is about Sis, and the second one is about Un. The first one comes from the very beginning of the story, and the second one comes in the middle of the story when Un is in the Ice Palace. So the first extract goes like this. A young white forehead boring through the darkness. An 11-year-old girl. Sis. It was really only afternoon, but already dark. A hard frost in late autumn. Stars, but no moon, and no snow to give a glimmer of light. So the darkness was thick in spite of the stars. On each side was the forest, deathly still, with everything that might be alive and shivering there at that moment. Sis thought about many things as she walked, bundled up against the frost. She was on her way to Un, a girl she scarcely knew, for the first time. On her way to something unfamiliar, which was why it was exciting. And now the passage about Un. A blinding flood of light. Un had lost all ties with everything but light. The staring eye had burned up. Everything was light. She thought dully that there was an awful lot of it. She was ready for sleep. She was even warm as well. It was not cold in here at any rate. The pattern in the ice wall danced in the room. The light shone more strongly. Everything that should have been upright was upside down. Everything was piercingly bright. Not once did she think this was strange. It was just as it should be. She wanted to sleep. She was languid and limp and ready. So, looking now more closely at these two passages, they are very different in style. The first one hints at many of the main themes of this story. There is constant reference to darkness. The young white forehead was boring through the darkness. There was no moon. There was no glimmer of light. And the darkness was thick. And she's in the middle of the forest. So darkness is important in this extract, as it is in the rest of the book, both literally because of the time of year, it gets dark early and it gets light late, but also figuratively. There is a darkness in the story, in what happens, the darkness of what takes place, and also darkness in terms of not knowing. The girls don't understand what's going on, or at least Sis doesn't understand what's going on. And the other theme, which goes all the way through the story, is cold. And so we're given some cold vocabulary in this extract too. We're told that everything was shivering, and we're told that Sis is bundled up against the frost, so she's wrapped up in lots of clothes because it's cold. And in contrast to this is the second passage. In the second passage there is a lot of light. It's not just light, it's blinding light. It's a blinding flood of light. And it blinds Un. The staring eye that's been looking down on her, presumably is the sun, has burned up and everything is light. And even Un thinks there's an awful lot of it. A couple of sentences later, it talks about piercingly bright. So light is very important in this passage, in contrast to the darkness in the previous passage. Also, where we had cold in the previous passage, we have warmth here. We're told that she is warm, which is strange given that she's in an ice palace. She should be cold. And of course that is part of the effect of being exposed to cold temperatures for a long time. You do start to eventually feel warm and sleepy, which is what is happening to Un here. So we have one passage about darkness and cold, featuring Sis, and another passage about light and warmth, featuring Un. And there are also a few clues about the girls and their characters from these passages as well. We get the sense that Un is on an adventure. We're told she's excited. She's going to something unfamiliar, but instead of being nervous about that, she's excited. She's looking forward to an adventure. In the passage about Un, we're told she's ready. She's ready for sleep. She wants to sleep. We're given the sense that she's somehow been relieved of some kind of burden. She feels at peace so that now she can sleep in peace. Leaving the themes for a moment, let's just have a little look at some of the language used in here. Most people will remember at school being taught always to write in full sentences, yet this begins with incomplete sentences. So why is that? One sentence says, an 11-year-old girl. The basic rules of English grammar tell us that a sentence must have as a bare minimum a subject and a predicate. A subject is a noun or a pronoun, somebody or something, and the predicate is the verb that goes with it. So you have to have a person and a verb, or an object and a verb. So in an 11-year-old girl, there is no verb, there is only the person. So it's an incomplete sentence. And then the next one just says Sis. We have a name, but we have no verb, so it's an incomplete sentence. And then a moment later, we've got a hard frost in late autumn. It's telling us a little bit of information, but it's not telling us fully in a full sentence. So why do we have this here? As we read it, it feels rather like stage directions. It's at the beginning of the book. It's at the beginning of a scene. So it's like the stage directions written in a play before the play starts to instruct the people setting up the stage what they need to do. In comparison, let's take a look here at the opening of Shakespeare's Macbeth, which is a play. At the very beginning, after the list of characters, there is a list of stage directions, and they're printed in italics to make them stand out from the rest of the play so that you know it's not a part of the dialogue, it's not the words that the actors speak, it's just information for the people setting up the theatre. So the beginning of Macbeth reads, a desert heath, thunder and lightning. Compare that to an 11-year-old girl. Sis, a hard frost in late autumn. It's as if he's setting out a play. It's as if he's setting up the stage, setting the scene ready for the play to start. And Un and Sis are the characters in the play. The same thing happens in the second passage. Even though it's not the beginning of the book, it's setting a scene again. A blinding flood of light. It's as if it's a stage direction to the people off stage that we need some special effects here, we need a blinding flood of light. It's setting the scene as if it's a play. And now for our language focus. We're going to look at another aspect that is a little unusual and unconventional in the two passages that we just read. We're going to look at the comma splice. What is a comma splice? It is where two sentences are joined together with a comma, when really they should be separated with a full stop or a period, or joined together with a conjunction such as and or but, for example. And usually teachers tell their students not to use comma splices. Comma splices are frowned upon in English and should generally be avoided. And yet we have a couple of examples here. We have, she was ready for sleep. She was even warm as well. And we have, the pattern in the ice wall danced in the room. The light shone more strongly. So according to the usual grammar conventions, the first one should either be, she was ready for sleep, full stop. She was even warm as well. Or we could join it with and. She was ready for sleep and she was even warm as well. And the second example should normally be either divided with a full stop. The pattern in the ice wall danced in the room. The light shone more strongly. Or it should be joined with a conjunction. The pattern in the ice wall danced in the room and the light shone more strongly. So why has the translator chosen to use the comma splice here? These rules of grammar are English rules of grammar, but the Ice Palace is a translation from another language. And grammar rules are not all identical in every language. What is acceptable in one language might not be in another. Punctuation that is acceptable in one language might not transfer very easily to another language. So it's possible that in the original Vesaas used commas to separate these two clauses, and the translator has decided to keep it. Translation is not the same as writing. In writing, you start from scratch, but in translation, the text already exists. So the translator has to decide how faithful they're going to be to the original text, or whether they're going to be more adventurous with their translation and play around with the language and the grammar and the structures. And even if the comma splice isn't the norm in Norwegian, if the author chooses to use unconventional structures and unconventional grammar, then the translator may decide to keep that because it's a better reflection of the original. So I would be interested to know the thought process that went on behind that decision. Now for our writing prompt. We've talked a lot about the cold. The backdrop of this book is cold. It's about ice. It's about a palace made of ice and the effects of cold on the person inside it. So for our writing prompt, write a scene about the cold, whether that's a voyage in the Arctic or just drinking a cold drink on a hot day. Write about something cold. How does it feel to you or to the character experiencing this cold? Is it a welcome relief, or is it a negative force that has to be fought against? As usual, when you're writing, try to avoid all the usual cliches. So for cold, that could be biting or numb, all the words that are usually associated with cold. Try to come up with new ways of looking at the cold. You could even experiment with personifying the cold to bring the scene to life even more. There is, of course, a worksheet to accompany this lesson, which includes all the things we've discussed and the extracts. On the More to Explore section of this worksheet, I've included a couple of links to further reading about the Norwegian language and Norwegian literature if you're interested to learn more about that. Thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you in the next video, and in the meantime, Happy writing!